Every book has its hero, every video game has its protagonist, and history books also have their hero. There are many claimants to the crown over the years, many rulers, soldiers, scientists, creators, and people who have had a great impact on the world. But you know how to read and know what the video is called, so you know that the main hero of history and about whom we will talk today is Alexander the Great. Like every hero, Alexander also has a story steeped in intrigues, plots, difficulties, and above all, fateful decisions, the results of which we feel to this day. After all, we live in a post-Hellenistic world, a world that strongly feels the Roman occupation, who came up with a genius patent and discovered that if you destroy your enemies, there are no more wars. The Romans were Alexander's fanboys, to say the least. Julius Caesar, aka wannabe Alexander, would make a pilgrimage to Alexandria in order to draw some of his greatness. Luckily, he didn't find Alexander's body, or that wouldn't have been the only thing Caesar would draw. But everyone knows about Alexander and his great conquests, or at least the people who watch this type of videos. The man named more than 200 different cities after his name or after his horse. This is a man who conquered the entire ancient world and reached parts of it that were not known at all. It's quite a white person of mine to generalize Europe as the ancient world and ignore the other ancient civilizations, but I didn't claim that I wasn't biased. Today, we will try to understand what made Alexander become the Alexander, what chain of events in his life made him a fear-inspiring conqueror, a wise and complete man. A little background on Alexander before he received the great title. Alexander III was born in the city of Pella, the capital of Macedon, to Philip II, king of Macedon, and his fourth wife, Olympias, a princess from neighboring Epirus. Before we talk about the Great One, we must understand who his role models were, the people who made him who he was. Olympias was a soccer mom, to say the least. She was involved in Alexander's life, took care of all his needs. Olympias enjoyed great influence in the royal court of Macedon and was a major driving force in the upbringing and shaping of the personality of the heir to the throne, Alexander. But one clear day, Olympias found her husband with the babysitter in a somewhat awkward position, and from there, their marriage came to an end. Even while they were married, the relationship between them was very tense, because Olympias was domineering and complained that her husband did not lift a finger in the household chores. While her husband was thinking about military conquests and loot, which may have included other women as well. Olympias took the child and possessions and left home. The legends say that she also took Philip's Lamborghini and his lucky armor on an optimistic note. "Sandra, I miss my children. Maybe you'll let me see them." While Philip married a new wife, who also shares a name with his daughter from Olympias, was a total kinky guy. From there, Philip and Olympias continued to hate each other, but were willing to put the dispute aside for Alexander. On the other side of the road, we have Philippus, a Macedonian king with a very impressive beard. He was the king of Macedonia from 336, 359 BC. Philip expanded the borders of his kingdom and established its economic situation. During his reign, Macedon rose to greatness and a leading position in ancient Greece. His victory at the Battle of Gaugamela marked the end of Greek independence. From that battle, hegemony finally passed from the Greek polis to foreign parties, meaning the Greeks lost their jobs and their freedom to immigrants, and people laughed at Trump, who said to build a wall. Philip was a military leader, and in common with the United States today, most of the tax and patronage money that came to the kingdom went to the army. He introduced military reforms and is considered one of the most brilliant generals of the ancient world. To this day, Alexander's haters try to diminish his achievements by claiming that his father built all the foundations for him, prepared the ground for him, and that he doesn't get credit for it at all. Either way, Philip was a key figure in Alexander's life. But unlike his mother, Philip was a shepherd in other fields and took many wives for himself, so that Alexander had to share his father's attention. But despite this, Philip loved Alexander and nurtured him. Another key figure in Alexander's life is the famous Greek philosopher Aristotle. Aristotle, Plato's student, was the father of modern science. He invented almost every theory of science known to us today. You must be asking yourself, what about Aristotle and Alexander? Well, Aristotle was Alexander's private tutor in his youth, So you'd be surprised what money can buy. Imagine that Stephen Hawking, before the Epstein affair, was your private teacher. How much knowledge and really practical information you could learn. Well, it was Aristotle to Alexander, and Alexander remembered his teacher and would send him findings from his conquests even when he rose to greatness. He did not forget where he came from. Remember Alexander's mother? It's a good thing because in 336 BC, Philip was murdered by one of his bodyguards named Pausanias. Philip's bodyguards immediately killed the assassin, and thus it was not possible to investigate his motives. My bet, once Alexander turned 18 and Philip stopped paying child support, she decided to make her move. After the murder of his father, Alexander's path to power was paved. From here, Alexander continued his conquests, defeated the largest empire of that time, Persia, and from there he continued to India, which was considered a no-man's land. His conquests and his time as a ruler are the subject of a film by itself. Maybe even a series of movies directed by Michael Bay with Megan Fox playing Megan Fox. But today, we will not talk about the history of Alexander, but about what kind of person Alexander was. Because no matter how much he insists on calling himself a god, he was a person who died of a fever and a good return at the age of 33. Now, all this information about the beginning of Alexander's life and the path that led him to power is very necessary for us in order to understand what kind of person Alexander was. While Alexander the Great is often celebrated for his military conquests and visionary leadership, there are aspects of his personality that suggest narcissistic tendencies. Narcissism, characterized by an inflated sense of self-importance, a constant need for admiration, and a lack of empathy for others, can be observed in certain facets of Alexander's behavior and actions. Firstly, Alexander exhibited an extreme sense of grandiosity, evident in his belief that he was destined for greatness and that he was a divine figure. I mean, the man's nickname is the Great. He famously claimed descent from the Greek hero Achilles and sought to emulate him in both military prowess and mythic status. Later in his years as a ruler, Alexander was upgraded, and from being a descendant of Achilles, he became a descendant of Zeus. His belief in his own divine right to rule was further exemplified by his adoption of Persian customs, including prostration, as a means of demonstrating his superiority over conquered peoples. Additionally, Alexander's insatiable thirst for conquest and glory suggests a need for constant validation and admiration. Despite achieving unprecedented success in his military campaigns, he continued to push his armies farther eastward, driven by an unquenchable desire for expansion and recognition. The situation was so dire that his men begged him to stop conquering. They wanted to rest. They were exhausted. They worked overtime on overtime. But Alexander thought of Alexander. In his obsessive pursuit of his legacy and his immortal status as a man, he did not stop fighting, even when he defeated the Persians. He continued to pursue the Persian emperor. The pursuit was part of his greatness. After all, he wanted to be the one to defeat the emperor. And the story goes that when he found out that assassins had killed the emperor on the run, he chased after them and killed them because someone had to die at the end of the story. Alexander's greatness complex started when he was still a child. Already as the heir to the throne, he realized that he was different from the rest of the people. The stories tell that no one could tame his faithful horse, but Alexander as a boy did it effortlessly. And to think that you thought you were a success because your mother hung your painting on the refrigerator. This story comes to illustrate to us that from a young age, Alexander aimed for greatness and actually separated himself from the rest of the people, since even as a boy, he succeeded in a task that adults and more experienced than him failed at. The stories don't stop there. The legend says that during a feast after another victory of Alexander, Alexander and his friend General Cleitus drank a lot and started to fight. To remind you, Alexander considers himself a god on earth. He didn't take kindly to someone disagreeing with him, threw a spear at his friend, and killed him. Alexander sinned and mourned the death of his friend because he did not want to kill. But the story illustrates that Alexander also had a dark side, which in some way dictated the course of Alexander's life, because at the end of the day, the thing that Alexander loved the most was Alexander, and what led to his downfall. It was his sin of hubris, because if he had returned to his kingdom and rested from his travels, he might not have contracted the virus that led to his death, or, according to the theories, poisoned by a disgruntled general who wanted to return home. Alexander's fate was known in advance, But either way, there is no doubt that this is one of the greatest figures in history.